During a nationally broadcast political talk show in Austin, Texas, watched live by over 4 million Americans and replayed more than 28 million times online, Karoline Leavitt interrupted Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence, hurling words laced with disdain. Entitled, "Playing the Victim, Acting Like Everyone Owes Her." The moment hit the airwaves like a flashbang, blinding, loud, and impossible to ignore. But Jasmine didn't fire back with fury. She chose precision over volume. Days later, with 62 pages of damning evidence and a powerhouse civil rights attorney beside her, she launched a defamation lawsuit that sent shockwaves through the political world. Will Karoline pay the $100 million price or slip away untouched yet again? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the floodlights of a live national broadcast in Austin, Texas, the stage was set for what was billed as a standard political roundtable. But the tension in the air said otherwise. Jasmine Crockett sat composed, her blazer sharp, her posture unshakable. The moderator asked a question about leadership in Congress, and Jasmine leaned forward, voice calm but resolute. "For women like me, there's no right tone," she said. "If I speak firmly, I'm labeled hostile. If I'm too quiet, I'm dismissed as unqualified. This is the burden of being both a woman and black in American politics." The room stilled. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. But her words struck with the precision of a scalpel, cutting into the pretense of equality that coated the panel like stage makeup. Eyes shifted. Breaths were held. Karoline Leavitt's smirk formed before her reply even left her lips. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, a practiced sparkle in her tone. "Well, maybe," she said with exaggerated politeness. "If some people stopped playing the victim and started acting like real leaders, they'd get the respect they claim they're missing." A few chuckles flickered nervously from the audience. Karoline wasn't finished. "And honestly, Jasmine, it's not your skin color that makes people tune you out. It's this constant sense that the world owes you something. That's not leadership. That's entitlement." The moderator's eyes widened. The panelist to Karoline's left blinked, visibly stunned. Someone backstage whispered into a headset. But the director didn't cut. The moment was spiraling. Yet Jasmine sat perfectly still. She reached forward and gently adjusted her mic, eyes locked on Karoline. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, but it cut through the studio like a blade. "I don't need anyone to owe me anything." The silence was immediate. "I speak with purpose because I carry generations who never had the chance. And if that discomforts you, that's not my burden to fix." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't waver. But the entire room recoiled as if hit by a wave. Karoline sat back, blinking fast. For a moment, everything froze. The moderator, the cameras, even the live audience. And in that stillness, one truth rang louder than anything that had been said. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to shout to own the moment. The stillness in the studio didn't end when the cameras cut. It was merely the beginning. As the broadcast faded to commercial, the internet lit up with a ferocity that even the producers hadn't anticipated. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's poised rebuttal and Karoline Leavitt's smirking insult was ripped, reposted, and replayed across every major platform within the hour. On Twitter, it took less than 7 minutes for the video to reach 1 million views. On TikTok, creators began breaking down every second, analyzing Jasmine's silence, Karoline's tone, the raised eyebrow, the tilt of the microphone. Each frame became a battlefield of meaning. News anchors paused live segments to address what they called a seismic cultural moment. Commentators and educators weighed in, calling the exchange a textbook case of veiled hostility dressed in political civility. One civil rights attorney described it as gaslighting in real time under the warm glow of studio lights. Another called it the kind of moment that black women know by muscle memory, an ambush of credibility beneath a smile. The intensity of the reaction didn't come from the words alone, but from what they revealed. People weren't just hearing Karoline, they were recognizing her. They were recognizing the pattern, the tone that implies superiority without saying it, the feigned innocence of, "I'm just being honest," the cold dismissal wrapped in a practiced grin. Viewers, especially women of color, described the experience of watching as visceral. One wrote, "It felt like being in the room again, the room where you're expected to smile through the insult because calling it out makes you the problem." Another said, "This wasn't a debate, it was domination by implication. The moment wasn't viral because it was shocking. It was viral because it was familiar. What Karoline said was not new. What was new was that Jasmine didn't flinch. And that stillness, the refusal to perform either anger or submission, left a nation breathless. But while the public dissected tone, history, and harm, Karoline Leavitt chose another path: defiance. When pressed by reporters the next morning outside a conservative talk show studio in Manhattan, she smiled like someone who thought the storm had passed. "I don't see what the big deal is," she said, holding her phone loosely in one hand. "I said what a lot of people are thinking. She just didn't want to hear it." The cameras caught everything: the shrug, the smirk, the dismissiveness. For her, this was still politics. For everyone else, it was personal. Educators began referencing the incident in classrooms. A psychology professor used it in a lecture about microaggressions in public discourse. A pastor rewrote his Sunday sermon around it. No one was debating whether Karoline's words were offensive. They were trying to understand why she believed they were acceptable, and her refusal to apologize, her insistence that it was just the truth, only deepened the wound. Jasmine Crockett said nothing in those first 24 hours. No press conferences, no tweets. But her silence wasn't absence. It was presence. It was weight. In a culture obsessed with instant reactions and digital clapbacks, Jasmine's restraint became the most powerful response of all. Because while Karoline thought she was winning the argument, the rest of the country was beginning to realize this wasn't an argument anymore. It was evidence. But silence doesn't shield the past. It awakens it. As Karoline Leavitt stood firm in her refusal to apologize, brushing off the incident as if it were a nuisance rather than a national flashpoint, the deeper reckoning began. Not with shouts, but with receipts. People weren't content with her explanation anymore. They wanted context, and what they uncovered wasn't a single misstep. It was a pattern, methodical and chilling. A podcast episode from 2021 resurfaced first. In it, Karoline mocked the concept of code switching, her tone smug, her laughter uninterrupted. "Just talk like a normal person," she said dismissively. "I don't need a black voice and a white voice. Just say what you mean." Her co-host had laughed along, but the audio didn't age quietly. It landed like a cold slap, especially for viewers who had spent their careers walking the tightrope of linguistic survival in rooms that never truly welcomed them. And then came the tweet. It wasn't an old one buried in the distant past. It was just 2 years prior. After Jasmine Crockett held a town hall on economic equity in Dallas, Karoline had tweeted, "Aggressive and ghetto in heels. Classic no context, no apology, just 5 words soaked in contempt." The post was deleted months later, but the internet forgets nothing. Screenshots reemerged with timestamps, archived links, and commentary from users who remembered feeling the sting even then. But more revealing than the words was the posture behind them. A pattern of reducing powerful black women to caricatures, of using coded language while hiding behind plausible deniability. It wasn't just cruelty, it was craft. And that craft, once exposed, told the real story. Karoline hadn't spoken from impulse. She had spoken from habit. The turning point came not from a journalist, but from someone who once sat quietly behind her. A former campaign aide, anonymous at first, later verified, delivered the bomb that rewrote the narrative. A string of internal emails, Slack messages, and debate prep documents painted a picture so precise, so disturbingly calculated, that it could no longer be explained away as coincidence. One email, dated 6 days before the broadcast, was labeled, "Rapid response if race is mentioned." It advised, don't shut it down. Let it breathe, then discredit it. Say it's victimhood culture. Say it's divisive. Keep your tone calm, but make her look fragile. Another message went further. Use buzzwords: strong, tough love, real talk. Make it sound like concern, not attack. Then pivot hard to personal responsibility. These weren't talking points. They were traps. drawn in plain text, planned like a campaign, not to inform or challenge, but to provoke and diminish. The media latched on within hours. Headlines shifted from panel clash to planned gaslighting exposed. Legal analysts began calling it a textbook example of premeditated character assault. Professors of rhetoric held lectures analyzing Karoline's phrasing, inflection, and posture. The conclusion was unnerving. This wasn't about disagreement. It was about performance, executed with the intention to destabilize a black woman on live television while leaving just enough ambiguity to deny the intent. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, remained silent. But behind the walls of her office, a team of aides and legal minds worked late into the night. They weren't just collecting insults. They were collecting proof. Not for the court of public opinion, but for something far more permanent. Because when the insult is crafted with this much care, it becomes something more than offensive. It becomes admissible. But when humiliation is engineered, when every smirk is backed by a memo, and every insult is rehearsed in bullet points, then silence stops being graceful. It becomes a wound. Jasmine Crockett had carried that wound through years of hearings, interviews, and backroom politics, letting things slide, taking the high road, choosing composure over confrontation. But now the line had been crossed, clean, deliberate, and on live television. And this time there would be no retreat. Behind the tinted windows of her Dallas office, the mood was electric with focus. The air itself seemed sharper. Every surface was covered in paper, annotated transcripts, authenticated screenshots, deposition offers, phone logs. Jasmine stood over the table like a strategist at war. This wasn't about an insult anymore. This was about the infrastructure of disrespect and dismantling it piece by piece. Brandon Keyes sat across from her, laptop open, glasses low on his nose, scanning the final draft of the legal complaint. His style wasn't loud. He never raised his voice, but every word he spoke felt like the chamber before a gunshot. Precise, quiet, unstoppable. 63 pages, he said without looking up, with hard proof, time-stamped motive, and chain of command intent. This isn't just defamation. It's professional sabotage. Jasmine nodded once. She didn't need a pep talk. She'd spent the last week rewatching the footage of Karoline's smirk, rereading the internal memos, remembering the look in the moderator's eyes when the room froze. None of it surprised her, but all of it mattered now. Brandon turned the screen toward her. "Once you sign this," he said, "everything changes. We don't just step into the arena. We turn the lights on." That afternoon, she walked into the briefing room without security or statement cards. Just her, a microphone, and the storm she was about to command. Reporters were already waiting, the room packed shoulder to shoulder, the hum of news cameras growing louder by the second. Jasmine stepped up to the podium with the composure of someone who had held her breath for too long and was finally ready to exhale. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't blink. "This lawsuit," she began, "is not about outrage. It's about accountability. And more than that, it's about setting a standard. Because if we keep moving the goalposts for what disrespect looks like, we'll wake up in a world where dignity is optional." The room went quiet. She let it settle before finishing. "We need to draw a line, a real one, between disagreement and degradation. And this is where I draw mine." She didn't wait for applause. She turned, walked out, and let the weight of her words hang like the sound of a gavel in a silent room. But drawing the line doesn't just shift the conversation. It forces the mask to fall. The moment Jasmine Crockett filed her lawsuit, a quiet ripple moved through the power corridors Karoline Leavitt once walked so easily. But by dawn the next day, that ripple had become a full-scale retreat. Corporate sponsors, many of whom had stood by her through smaller controversies, began pulling contracts without ceremony. A wellness brand known for empowering women through bold voices terminated their partnership via a terse one-line email. A podcast network removed her episode archive, replacing it with a placeholder that simply read, "Under review." Her literary agent, once fiercely loyal, left a voicemail that ended with, "We can't move forward together, Karoline." It's not personal, it's pattern. Even her calendar, once filled with speaking tours and network appearances, began to clear itself. as if the universe were wiping her off the slate. Still, Karoline didn't flinch, at least not in public. That evening, she set up her home camera, applied studio lighting, and went live on her personal streaming page. Framed by carefully placed props, a Constitution print, an American flag, a biography of Reagan, she stared into the lens with defiance sharpened into performance. Her voice was clipped, performative, the tone of someone convinced the world was overreacting. "I poke her," she said with a half smile, "and she sues me? Are we really doing this?" She laughed, casually sipping from a mug that read, "Unapologetic." But her attempt to minimize the lawsuit collapsed before she even ended the stream. The clip was cut mid-laugh, posted by a journalist, and then duplicated across a dozen major platforms within minutes. What might have once been brushed off as bravado now read as something else. Contempt. For boundaries, for accountability, for the damage she'd caused. But the real tremor came not from media, but from inboxes. That same night, Jasmine's legal office received a message marked urgent, former staff. It was short, unsigned, but direct. "She's done this before. I can prove it." The attachments that followed were chilling. Email chains from campaign strategy sessions, debate prep notes, bullet points targeting specific progressive women of color with language designed to provoke. One slide, labeled "De-escalation through dominance," advised speakers to use calm condescension to trigger emotional responses. Another noted, "Don't insult race directly, suggest weakness, hypersensitivity, let the audience connect the dots." It was a weaponized instruction manual for gaslighting, hiding behind smiles and faux concern. And more messages followed. A former production assistant sent over audio from a team huddle where Karoline laughed about breaking Crockett on air. Another described a workshop where interns role-played confrontation tactics. These weren't whispers. They were floodgates opening. For Jasmine, each new document was confirmation of what she had always felt, but had never been allowed to say without being accused of paranoia. Now the proof was laid bare, cold, calculated, and cruel. What the world had seen in a 43-second clip was not a misstep. It was the final act of a performance long in the making. Karoline hadn't just crossed a line. She had built a stage over it. And now the lights were on, the audience was watching, and every co-star she had trained to stay silent was stepping forward, script in hand, ready to testify. But when the stage collapses and the mask is gone, what remains is the echo. Echoes that ripple far beyond politics, reaching places power never planned for. As Karoline's world unraveled in boardrooms and inboxes, another world was stirring, quietly, deliberately, and with a weight far more enduring than hashtags or headlines. In a public high school on the south side of Milwaukee, a government teacher dimmed the lights and cued the now infamous footage. Jasmine Crockett sitting steady, while Karoline delivered the smirk-laced insult seen around the world. The class watched in silence. No commentary, no dramatic narration, just raw, uninterrupted reality. When it ended, the teacher didn't speak. A student, maybe 16, finally broke the stillness. Why is the calm one always the one expected to explain herself? That single question turned into a classroom-wide reflection. They weren't just studying political speech anymore. They were deconstructing coded power. And suddenly, Jasmine wasn't a headline. She was curriculum. The movement spread without banners. Across the country, teachers downloaded lesson plans titled Tone, Power, and Race in Modern Discourse. AP English students in Atlanta were assigned essays not on Shakespeare, but on Crockett's silence, asked to analyze restraint as rhetoric, dignity as resistance. In Queens, a substitute teacher who rarely spoke in staff meetings requested to lead a session on linguistic bias in televised debate, using Jasmine's exchange as the foundation. Schools began organizing assemblies, not to talk about the lawsuit, but about how language carries implication long after the microphone is off. And everywhere, in notes passed, essays typed, and journals scribbled in lockers, Jasmine Crockett's name became shorthand for a kind of power that had no slogan, only presence. Not everyone agreed with her politics, but almost no one could deny what she represented now, a refusal to be reduced. In a small church on the outskirts of Birmingham, Alabama, the sermon took an unexpected turn. Reverend Marcus Eldridge, a 62-year-old pastor with a voice like gravel and smoke, paused mid-prepared scripture. He reached behind the pulpit and held up a still image from the panel broadcast, a freeze frame of Jasmine's face, right after Karoline's last jab. "This," he said slowly, "is what it looks like when a woman carries centuries in her spine." No one in the congregation breathed. This is what it means to walk into a room already under suspicion and still refuse to fold. The congregation didn't shout. They didn't clap. They sat with it, deeply. That moment was recorded, uploaded, and by Monday it had been played in more than 30 churches from Oakland to Tallahassee. Not because it was viral, but because it was gospel. Jasmine had become more than a figure in a suit. She had become a reflection of everything power tried to silence and everything history had failed to reckon with. Meanwhile, local governments began taking notice. In Newark, the city council opened a session with a motion to implement respectful discourse training for all public employees. One councilwoman stood and declared, "We will not wait for the courts to decide what dignity looks like. We've already seen it." In Minneapolis, a civic youth leadership program restructured its spring curriculum to include a unit titled Power and Poise, Public Silence as Political Strength. Jasmine's photo now sat beside quotes from Maya Angelou and Shirley Chisholm, not as a political figure, but as an example of modern restraint with historic gravity. Community centers held panels. University classrooms assigned her posture as primary text. And all the while, Jasmine Crockett herself had not made a single public comment since the suit was filed. She didn't need to, because everywhere her name appeared, in books, in bulletins, on murals, the message was already clear. Her silence was not absence. It was defiance made visible. But when silence becomes a symbol, the next sound the world waits for is justice. And on the morning the trial began, the air around the Harris County Courthouse didn't feel like a legal proceeding. It felt like the opening scene of a national reckoning. Steel barricades lined the sidewalk. Reporters shouted into wind-blown microphones as satellite vans hummed behind them. 18 television cameras were stationed across the courtroom, like sentinels, flanked by dozens of still photographers from national and international media. Courtroom seats were claimed before sunrise. CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera were all on site, broadcasting live. The nation wasn't just watching, it was holding its breath. The debate that had once been framed as just politics was now on trial in the formality of wood-paneled silence and sworn testimony. But if the room was tense, it cracked the moment the doors opened. Karoline Leavitt entered first. Her heels struck the marble floor like applause. Dressed in navy, chin high, she gave a clipped nod to the gallery, her smile rehearsed, her walk deliberate. It was the swagger of someone still convinced this was performance, not consequence. Her lawyers flanked her, briefcases in hand, faces tightened with the subtle panic of men who'd read too many op-eds in too few depositions. Karoline sat, crossed her legs, and flashed a grin toward the press section. Then came Jasmine. No entourage, no glances to the crowd. She stepped in quietly, wearing a matte gray suit and no jewelry, as if to strip the moment of anything but purpose. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was immovable. She did not smile. She did not blink. She sat down at the plaintiff's table and placed a single pen beside her case folder, then folded her hands with the calm of someone who no longer had anything to prove. Judge Ellis Rawlins, a man known for his zero-tolerance courtroom and fondness for direct language, took his seat with a stern expression sharpened by years of high-profile trials. He glanced once across the room, then brought down the gavel. The air shifted. "Let the record reflect," he said, voice low but resonant. "This court recognizes the extraordinary public attention on this matter, but attention does not equal influence. This will be a trial, under law, not opinion." And with that, the process began. Jury selection followed. No formality spared, no voice left untested. Each juror was questioned not just on their politics, but their understanding of coded language, public narrative, and bias. It was meticulous, exhausting, but necessary, because what was being tried here wasn't just defamation. It was dignity, and who gets to define it? But in the arena of accountability, Defense by distortion is a familiar game, and Karoline's legal team played it with all the polish of seasoned tacticians, but none of the moral weight. On the second day of trial, as the courthouse swelled with spectators and cameras rolled from the press balcony, Karoline's lead attorney, Mitchell Graves, rose with theatrical calm. Tall, silver-templed, and known for his flair in front of juries, he moved deliberately to the center of the room, thumbs hooked inside his blazer. "This," he said, gesturing to the plaintiff's table, where Jasmine Crockett sat unmoving, "is not a case of malice. It is a case of misunderstanding. My client expressed a political opinion. That is not defamation. That is democracy." His voice was smooth, but his rhythm calculated. He wasn't speaking to the judge. He was performing for the 12 pairs of eyes in the jury box, hoping to invoke the well-worn refuge of free speech without reckoning with the cost of its abuse. Then came the screens. With a soft click, the defense triggered a video compilation, and the courtroom dimmed as a massive monitor lit up with edited footage. Jasmine, in various committee rooms and press conferences, appeared forceful, unyielding, animated. One clip showed her raising her voice during a tense floor debate. Another caught her sharply interrupting a fellow representative. "Is this the voice of someone silenced?" Graves asked, turning to the jury. "Or the voice of someone accustomed to confrontation?" The question hung in the air like smoke. He didn't wait for an answer. More clips rolled. Fast cuts, abrupt transitions, each selected to portray Jasmine not as a target of defamation, but as a political brawler. But what the defense didn't show, and what the courtroom didn't forget, were the missing seconds. The moments before Jasmine raised her voice. The provocations, the insults, the interruptions. The rooms that treated her as a guest rather than a peer. Outside the courthouse, the narrative didn't land as cleanly as Graves had hoped. Legal commentators began issuing real-time rebuttals, pausing the edited clips side by side with the originals. A constitutional law professor from Howard called the tactic weaponized context collapse, adding, "When you amputate the cause and only present the reaction, you're not seeking clarity, you're selling caricature." Social media echoed the sentiment. Viewers weren't just watching a trial, they were watching a familiar story. A black woman's strength being mislabeled as aggression, her clarity twisted into combativeness, her composure punished because it couldn't be controlled. Comment threads filled with stories, professionals, students, activists, all recalling the moment they too had been told their voice was too much, simply for being heard. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained still. She didn't interrupt. She didn't object. She sat like stone, because she didn't need to prove she had been misrepresented. The defense was doing it for her, one clip at a time. But when distortion gives way to documentation, the temperature in the courtroom changes, not with fire, but with cold precision. Brandon Keyes didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace or posture. He simply walked to the center of the courtroom, paused, and opened a black binder so thick it looked like a case file from a federal prosecution. The words he spoke next weren't dramatic. They were devastating. "What the defense calls opinion," he said, voice smooth as glass, "was rehearsed provocation, and I will prove that, line by line." Then the screens lit up. The first message appeared. Plain, unstyled, undeniable. It was a Slack conversation from Karoline Leavitt's media team, dated 3 days before the Austin broadcast. "She'll probably bring up systemic bias. Let her. That's when we pivot. Make it sound like she's making excuses." Another reply followed. "People are tired of race talk. Let her walk into that. You just look annoyed and rational." Brandon let the silence breathe. He didn't editorialize. He let the jury read it for themselves. Then came the emails. Emails with subject lines like panel talking points. Provocation angle, race pivot triggers, weakness language, test phrases. One line in bold, pulled from an internal prep doc, read, "Smirk when she invokes history, makes her sound rehearsed." The courtroom didn't gasp. It sank, slowly, inexorably. It was no longer a question of whether the insult was cruel. It was a question of how long they had planned to make it look accidental. Then Brandon played the tape. The audio, recovered from a hot mic before the show began, was barely cleaned up. It didn't need to be. Caroline's voice was unmistakable. If she goes into trauma mode, I'll keep it light. Flip it on her. They hate that. A male voice, likely a producer, laughed in the background. Gonna bait her again? Caroline replied, low but clear. That's the point. There was no context to misread, no framing to dispute, just intention, raw, casual, and cruel. Brandon didn't speak again. He clicked the recording off, stepped aside, and called his next witness. A television producer took the stand, shoulders square, jaw tense, hands locked together like she'd been holding something in for too long. I was there that day, she began. I saw the prep documents. I saw the call sheets. But none of that included what she said on air. That moment wasn't off script. It was a script we were never shown. Her voice never broke, but her conviction was volcanic. That smirk wasn't spontaneous. That tone wasn't off the cuff. I've produced live TV for 17 years, and I've never seen someone so calmly weaponize subtle racism with that much accuracy. And then, perhaps most chilling of all, came the intern. 24 years old, nervous, pale, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded a copy of a training memo. I was assigned to her communications team during the state circuit, he said. This is what we were told to study. He held up the paper. On screen, the jury saw its title projected in block font. Tactics for Undermining Minority Opposition, Engage, Control, Reframe. And beneath it, bullet points, clinical, rehearsed, soulless. Look for phrases like community, history, or representation. Respond with responsibility, leadership, or victim culture. If the subject is female and black, allow her to build emotional momentum, then counter with a calm, dismissive tone. This creates visual dominance without verbal aggression. By the time he finished reading, the courtroom was frozen, not in confusion, but in clarity. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to testify that she had been targeted. The strategy to do so had already been printed, shared, and taught like doctrine. And now it stood exposed under oath, under light, under the unbearable weight of truth. But when planning becomes cruelty, and cruelty becomes casual, the courtroom stops being a legal chamber. It becomes a reckoning. The atmosphere was already dense from the prior revelations, but what followed shattered whatever emotional shield remained. Brandon Keyes stood at the center of the room, voice low, unwavering. Our next witness, he said, will not show you more strategy. She will show you consequence. Then he gestured gently toward the side door. The woman who stepped into the room didn't wear power like armor. She wore something far heavier, regret, truth, and a quiet kind of bravery. Her name was redacted for privacy, but the pain on her face needed no introduction. She took the stand slowly, her hands shaking as she raised them to be sworn in. Her eyes, already glossy with tears, never rose to meet Caroline's. I was Caroline Leavitt's communications assistant for 10 months, she began, voice barely above a whisper. I was young, hungry. I thought I was building a career. Then her voice wavered. But I wasn't building anything. I was helping sharpen weapons. She described the meeting that broke her, the one behind a closed door, just 5 days before the infamous panel. Caroline looked me straight in the eye and said, have a few personal lines ready in case Jasmine starts that race stuff. Keep it slick. Don't make it sound rehearsed. The words cracked something open. She paused, a single tear trailing down her cheek. She wanted me to write insults in advance, to make them feel spontaneous. That was the assignment, and I did it, until I couldn't anymore. She reached into a file and handed Brandon a printed sheet. He held it up so the jury could read. The header read, Counterpunch responses, if race is raised. The bullet points were short, clean, brutal. Leadership isn't about trauma. Don't ask for a seat at the table if you won't bring substance. Maybe earn respect before demanding it. Each line crafted not to challenge ideas, but to undercut identity, to humiliate with a smile. I wrote those, she said, choking on the words. She used pieces of them on air. I watched her do it, and I left that job 3 days later because I couldn't keep being part of it. She stopped, trembling now, but lifted her face. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because I saw someone get targeted with something I helped build, and I want to tear it down. Then Brandon turned slowly and gave a subtle nod to the audio technician. What followed wasn't a scream. It wasn't even loud, but it was the most disturbing sound the courtroom had heard. From a backstage studio mic, never meant to be public, Karoline's voice spilled out, easy and amused. I get these emails from angry black lady politicians all the time. So dramatic. I save the worst ones. It's free content, baby. The laughter in the background wasn't forced. It was familiar, routine, like they'd heard the line before. The room went still, so still, even the clicking of pens stopped. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keys. One juror visibly swallowed. Another clenched their jaw. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't blink. She didn't break. She just looked ahead, her silence holding more force than the voices that had tried to define her. This wasn't political theater anymore. It was a slow-motion exposure of cruelty, designed, rehearsed, monetized, and for the first time laid bare without disguise. But once humiliation has been dissected under oath, and manipulation no longer hides behind charm, the courtroom shifts from theater to verdict. For 3 full days, the jury deliberated in silence so thick it felt like the walls were listening. 12 strangers, diverse in age, race, and politics, now carried the weight of a national moment in their hands. They were shown not just a legal case, but a slow-motion assault masked as commentary, a campaign of calculated condescension dressed up in media polish. Behind closed doors, they reviewed everything: the emails, the training memos, the smirks, the laughter. They listened again to the tape of Karoline saying, "It's free content, baby." And they didn't ask what it meant. They asked how many people laughed before anyone said it was wrong. They were shown not one act of cruelty, but the repeat offense of indifference. And they understood. This wasn't just a slip. It was a system, personified. At exactly 4:17 p.m. on the third day, the jury filed in. The tension in the courtroom wasn't spoken. It was inhaled, held, suspended like breath under ice. Jasmine sat still, her palms flat against the table, her expression unreadable. Karoline sat 4 seats away, staring straight ahead, her attorney whispering something she didn't appear to hear. The foreman stood, voice steady but with a strain that betrayed the gravity of what he carried. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," he began. A beat passed. "We further find that the defendant, Karoline Leavitt, engaged in willful and malicious defamation with evidence of targeted conduct using media platforms to publicly humiliate, professionally sabotage, and emotionally distress the plaintiff." It wasn't just a verdict, it was a declaration. This happened, and we saw it. Then came the damages. The courtroom, bracing for the original $80 million claim, sat in suspended disbelief as the foreman read the adjusted sum aloud. $100 million. The number wasn't inflated, it was justified. Enhanced by the weight of documentation, of witness testimony, of emotional trauma that couldn't be quantified, but had to be acknowledged. The figure included damages for reputational destruction, loss of public trust, and psychological harm tied not to a single insult, but to a deliberate campaign. This wasn't accountability by suggestion, it was accountability by force. Because some lines are so often crossed, the only way to redraw them is with something irreversible. Karoline didn't blink. She didn't cry. But something in her collapsed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but inwardly. The way a building folds when its foundation silently gives way. Her hands were clenched, her jaw tight, but the facade was gone. The room saw her, not the pundit, not the performer, just the architect of her own undoing. Meanwhile, Jasmine didn't move for several seconds. When she finally turned, she didn't lift her chin or close her eyes or savor the moment. She simply reached out and gripped Brandon Key's hand. No words, no triumph. Just a quiet, grounding gesture between two people who had walked through fire and brought back the truth. And in that stillness, there was no gloating, only gravity. Because this was never about winning. It was about refusing to lose in silence. And when justice is finally spoken aloud, not whispered, not bargained for, but declared in full by 12 impartial voices, what follows is not celebration, it is aftermath. The gavel fell. The courtroom emptied slowly. as if no one wanted to be the first to exhale. Even the marble floors seemed reluctant to echo the footsteps of history. Outside the courthouse, barricades lined the wide stone steps like ribs protecting a national moment. Press vans blocked 3 lanes of traffic. Cameramen climbed rooftops for a clean shot. Protest signs and bouquets of sunflowers gathered at the gates like offerings left at the edge of a storm. But the air itself, the air waited. And then the doors opened. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't a roar. It was silence, charged with voltage. Jasmine Crockett stepped into the light. No entourage. No aides waving her forward. Just her. One woman against 1,000 lenses. The sun struck her black blazer and made it look like polished obsidian. Her heels didn't click. They landed. Measured, slow. The sound of decision in motion. Reporters surged but didn't dare shout. Microphones hovered but found no voice. America had just watched a courtroom transform into a reckoning chamber. And now it waited to see what the woman at the center of it all would say. But Jasmine said nothing. Not a word. Not even a glance at the cameras. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't posture. She looked ahead and through. Her eyes scanned the distance as if she were still in that courtroom, still hearing that recording, still weighing the cost of being both the target and the proof. And what the world saw in that stare wasn't triumph. It was clarity, a gaze forged by being dismissed, gaslit, and dehumanized. Then standing anyway. There are some victories too sacred for sound bites, some pain too eloquent for microphones. Jasmine Crockett understood that, and so she let her silence say everything. In that moment, 100 news stations held their breath. CNN replayed the walk 5 times in an hour. MSNBC looped it with no commentary, calling it the stare heard across America. Fox tried to interpret it as political theater, until their legal analyst interrupted. That's not theater. That's the weight of a verdict resting in a woman's bones. TikTok clips layered her walk with Nina Simone's "Feeling Good." Twitter exploded with a single frame. Jasmine looking to the horizon, her jaw clenched, her soul exposed but unbroken. One user captioned it, "She didn't win. She endured. That's bigger." And people agreed, not in hashtags but in silence. A silence that understood what it meant to survive character assassination with dignity intact. As Jasmine descended the final step, someone in the crowd broke protocol, not by yelling, but by whispering just loud enough to be heard by the microphones. "Thank you for not letting them erase you." Jasmine didn't stop, but her shoulders shifted, just barely, as if that one sentence had caught the wind behind her and pushed it through her spine. Brandon Keyes followed a few paces behind, his tie loose, eyes still alert like a soldier waiting for aftershocks. But even he didn't speak. It wasn't time for statements. It was time for presence. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt had exited quietly through a side door under the advice of counsel. No cameras, no statement, no contrition, just a black SUV, tinted windows, and the muffled slamming of a career folding into the shadows. She was gone before the verdict trended, before the soundbite surfaced, before America realized that what just happened wasn't the fall of a pundit. It was the exposure of an industry built on cruelty disguised as commentary, and Jasmine had walked straight through it. The cameras didn't blink. They zoomed, they followed. They clung to every frame of her retreat, not because they needed another quote, but because the silence itself had become historic. When she reached the edge of the crowd, a small child, no older than 7, broke through a loose gap in the barricade. The girl wore a pink jacket and carried a paper sign that read, "My voice matters too." Security stepped forward, unsure. But Jasmine paused, just for a second. Her eyes met the girl's. She didn't bend down. She didn't speak. But she raised her hand, just slightly, and touched 2 fingers to her chest, then pointed to the girl's heart. A gesture, a legacy. A vow passed from one generation to the next without a single word. Back in the newsroom control rooms, editors debated whether to cut the footage or let it roll. The consensus came quickly. Let it breathe. And so, for the first time in years, primetime news featured 60 full seconds of silence. No overlays, no pundits. Just Jasmine Crockett walking, alone, powerful, unshaken, Not a martyr, not a victor. A woman who had faced mockery not just in media but in method, who had been labeled angry, dramatic, inferior, and answered with truth so sharp it turned courts into mirrors. One anchor whispered it best. Some moments are too honest for language. That was the gaze Jasmine gave to America as she disappeared into the car waiting at the curb. She wasn't asking to be celebrated. She wasn't asking for redemption. She had never asked for anything but to be heard without having her humanity distorted. And now that the verdict had settled, and the nation had seen the blueprint for how degradation is monetized and normalized, her eyes offered only one final question. What will you do with what you now know? Then the door closed. The car pulled away. And the silence left behind wasn't empty. It was sacred. It was earned. And the world watching finally understood. You don't need to shout to be unforgettable. You just have to survive with your dignity louder than their lies. But the silence Jasmine left behind did not linger long. It transformed, first into whispers, then headlines, then declarations. Not of celebration, but of reckoning. Because when a black woman leaves a courtroom with $100 million in damages awarded for the humiliation she endured, the question isn't just about what she proved, it's about what we allowed. And that question spread like fire through the marrow of a nation that had grown used to calling cruelty just opinion. The morning after the verdict, the doors of every major civil rights organization opened early. From the NRACP's glass-walled press room in Baltimore to the legal roundtables at the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, emails surged with a single theme. This was a case study, yes. But more than that, it was a signal. A signal that boundaries long ignored were finally visible again. A signal that dehumanizing someone on air, for sport and ratings, now came with consequence. At exactly 9:03 a.m., the National Civil Rights Forum held a press conference streamed live on 6 networks. The room was packed wall to wall with attorneys, pastors, journalists, and young organizers wearing buttons that read, "Dignity is not up for debate." Chairwoman Darlene Voss approached the podium, not with notes but with resolve. Her voice was low, deliberate, the kind that doesn't rise to be heard because the truth in it does the work. "Let us be clear," she said. "What happened in that courtroom was not just about defamation. It was not just about politics. It was about drawing a line, in ink, in law, and in memory, between disagreement and degradation." The applause was not explosive. It was solemn, as if the room had been holding its breath for years. Other groups followed swiftly. The Urban Justice Collective posted a photo of Jasmine walking down the courthouse steps, captioned, "She walked out, but she left the door open behind her, for everyone still fighting to be seen." Color of Change issued a formal statement titled Beyond the Verdict, urging policymakers to address how media systems profit off racial dog whistles and targeted humiliation. The Congressional Black Caucus, usually slow to weigh in on lawsuits, released an uncharacteristically personal message. To witness dignity weaponized as vulnerability and turned into content, then finally confronted in court, is to witness more than justice. It is to witness history correcting itself. But it was a lesser-known group from Atlanta, the Bailey Initiative for Media Ethics, that delivered the line heard around the country. In an emergency panel held on public radio, Executive Director Omar Glenn leaned into the mic, voice raw from a sleepless night. "This is not a legal win," he said. "This is a moral one. This is not about what the court allowed. It's about what we finally stopped tolerating." Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself. She held up a mirror and made us all look. That quote traveled faster than the verdict itself. By noon, it was plastered across the morning shows, TikTok slideshows, and pulsing across Times Square on the Reuters board. College campuses updated their digital billboards. Not a legal win, a moral one. Churches quoted it in bulletins. Influencers stitched it into videos. It wasn't a slogan, it was a confession. The confession of a culture that had laughed too often when it should have listened. That had said it's just politics when it was actually humiliation. That had confused free speech with free cruelty. And as those words echoed, news stories began to surface. People who had been targets in their own fields but never had the cameras to prove it. A black anchor in St. Louis resigned after finding a leaked email from her station director suggesting she wear her hair less urban during prime time. A Latina lawmaker shared screenshots from a group chat where opponents debated how to bait her into a meltdown on air. These weren't isolated events, they were symptoms, and Jasmine Crockett's case had pulled the curtain back. More than 50 legal scholars signed on to a joint article titled "The Cost of Being Heard, Defamation, Identity, and Digital Warfare," calling for new federal standards on televised political speech and the right to redress after reputational harm. Law students across the country requested to study Crockett versus Leavitt as a model for balancing First Amendment protections with ethical media conduct. One of the co-authors, Dr. Malik Thompson, told NPR, "This verdict may become what New York Times versus Sullivan was in 1964, a new stake in the ground about public discourse and human dignity." Yet even as institutions rushed to contextualize the case, grassroots organizers were doing something deeper, reclaiming the silence Jasmine wielded as a tool of resistance. They began hosting dignity walks, events where black women marched in silence through courthouses, media centers, and local governments, dressed in black with their mouths covered by gold tape that read, "Unbothered, unmoved, unapologetic." Photos from Detroit, Philadelphia, and Oakland flooded social media. One caption read, "We walk like Jasmine. We speak when it's time, and when we don't, we make the silence louder than the insult." But the story wasn't just shaping the nation, it was reshaping language. For years, phrases like "playing the victim," "too sensitive," "just banter" had gone unchecked in political commentary. After the verdict, newsrooms began re-examining editorial guidelines. Anchors caught themselves mid-sentence and corrected. Panelists previously praised for being blunt were now asked, "Liv, are you being blunt or are you demeaning someone?" It was subtle, but it was seismic, because one woman's courtroom silence had recalibrated the sound of public decency. Even school districts responded. Several high schools in Georgia and Maryland announced curriculum changes to include discussions on coded language, tone policing, and identity-driven microaggressions. A middle school teacher in Texas posted a letter on Reddit, later reposted by thousands, that read, "Today my students asked if respect had a price tag. I told them no, but it has a courtroom now, and that's a start." In an unplanned press huddle outside a community center, civil rights icon Reverend Alicia Boone was asked whether she saw the case as precedent. She paused, her cane leaning against a rusted bench, and said softly, "Precedent is what the court gives you, but permission, that's what women like Jasmine give us. Permission to push back, permission to say, this is not how I will be spoken to, not here, not again." The camera caught her wiping away a tear, and America, still bruised from a culture that had for too long praised sharp tongues and punished quiet strength, began to understand. This wasn't about one verdict. It was about restoring the price of disrespect. Because Jasmine Crockett never asked to become a symbol. She simply refused to disappear. And in doing so, she forced a nation to confront what it has always struggled to admit, that some of our most applauded voices were never bold. They were cruel. That some of our most silent souls were never weak. They were just tired of being interrupted. And this time, when a woman said nothing, everyone finally listened. And just as swiftly as the nation spoke Jasmine's name in reverence, it began whispering Karoline's in disbelief. There was no press conference, no carefully worded statement from a publicist, no tearful live stream or last-minute defense, only silence, cold, mechanical, absolute. It began with a single refresh. At 6:04 a.m., a political analyst in Washington tried to pull up Karoline Leavitt's podcast for a morning segment. It was gone. The future right, once a top 10 show among conservative youth, returned a 404 error. The RSS feed was stripped bare. No archive, no notice. At first, people assumed it was a server glitch. By 6:12 a.m., her official Twitter profile, a page that once averaged 3 viral tweets a day, vanished without warning. No @ no profile picture. Just a blank page with the message, "This account doesn't exist." Then came her Instagram, then YouTube, then her personal website, all wiped within a window so tight, cybersecurity experts on Reddit began theorizing whether this was a coordinated takedown. But it wasn't. It was a shutdown, voluntary, controlled, and panicked. By 6:30 a.m., internet sleuths noticed something chilling. Every trace of Karoline's digital voice was vanishing in reverse order, from most recent to oldest. Commentaries disappeared mid-scroll. Captions on political clips were replaced with blank metadata. Even tags on old debate videos were being removed as if her algorithmic fingerprints were being erased by someone inside the house. News anchors struggled to explain it live. "This is unprecedented," one host on MSNBC stammered. "We've seen people deplatformed, but not like this. Not someone vanishing by choice. Not this fast." On Fox News, the silence was even louder. By 7:10 a.m., they cut away from their usual political coverage entirely, opting to show weather maps and traffic congestion instead of addressing the storm unraveling in their own ranks. Behind the scenes, her sponsors were already gone. Overnight, payment processors suspended her accounts. The data trail was clear. Large brands and ad firms had received hundreds of emails demanding disassociation within minutes of the verdict. One internal memo from her former merchandise partner leaked, "No contract clause can survive this. Pull every SKU now." And they did. Shopify stores, closed. Patreon, empty. Her likeness scrubbed from affiliate banners, thumbnails replaced with stock images. It wasn't just a fall from grace. It was a controlled demolition. Some of her former allies tried to defend her, tried to say it was cancel culture, tried to spin the verdict as judicial overreach. But even they couldn't ignore what was obvious. Karoline was running. From what? From accountability, from humiliation, or from a truth she never imagined would echo this loudly. No one knew. But what was clear was this: Karoline Leavitt, once the rising star of the digital right, had become a ghost by sunrise. And then came the audio. At 9:42 a.m., a TikTok user posted a 7-second screen recording of Karoline's podcast app with a previously downloaded episode titled "Silence is Weakness." But as she tapped play, the audio glitched, then cut. The screen faded into black with only a whisper audible in the static. "If they turn on you, vanish." Whether it was doctored or real didn't matter. The post hit 1 million views in less than an hour. The message was now part of the lore. Her erasure became its own myth, a warning, a symbol, a ghost story for pundits who mistake cruelty for clout. But not everyone was mourning. Many saw her disappearance as poetic. "She walked into a war with a matchbox, thinking the fire wouldn't catch her clothes," one user tweeted. "Now she's ash." Others were more blunt. A viral TikTok clip of Jasmine's silent exit from the courthouse was edited side by side with Karoline's vanishing profiles, soundtracked by Billie Eilish's "All the Good Girls Go to Hell." It wasn't just retribution, it was ritual, a digital cleansing. And Jasmine never said a word. She didn't have to. Still, there was one corner of the internet that refused to let the moment pass quietly. Archive forums and Reddit threads began documenting every trace of Karoline's online existence before it vanished. Screenshots of deleted tweets, transcripts of her broadcasts, even cached forum posts from her early campaigns were preserved like fossils. One user wrote, "Not for sympathy, for evidence." So no one forgets what she said, how she said it, and who she tried to bury with her microphone. Even her Wikipedia page became a battleground. For every edit that tried to soften the language, someone countered with a quote from the courtroom: "Aggressive and ghetto. Free content, baby. If she cries, we win." These phrases, once whispered in private group chats, now stared back from search bars and headlines. By noon, journalists stopped trying to contact Karoline directly. No voicemail, no email replies. Her former assistant told BuzzFeed anonymously, she didn't tell anyone she was pulling the plug. Not her team, not her family, just gone. A CNN analyst commented, "It's like she believes if she disappears fast enough, the shame can't catch her." But it already had. It was embedded in every platform she abandoned. It echoed through every blank page her followers now refreshed obsessively. looking for a final word that would never come. The psychological weight of her silence wasn't lost on the public. Experts began analyzing her disappearance like a cultural autopsy. Dr. Ava Morgan, a clinical trauma expert, told NPR, "People often think silence is surrender, but sometimes it's a strategy to avoid confrontation with the self. When a public figure chooses silence this loud, it's not absence, it's collapse." And collapse it was. By 3 p.m., every media outlet had updated their headlines. Karoline Leavitt, vanished in 24 hours, an unprecedented political implosion. The digital self-destruction of a rising star. No exit statement, no goodbye, just ghosts. And yet Jasmine said nothing. She didn't repost the headlines. She didn't comment on the vanishing. She didn't retweet a single meme, nor did she accept a single interview. Her silence wasn't empty. It was sovereign. Because where Karoline's absence screamed guilt, Jasmine's restraint roared with clarity. In a world addicted to reaction, Jasmine Crockett chose not to gloat.